Evening, or actually good morning.
Yes,
My name is Bryan
yes,
Toepfer, and thank you for being here today. So I
yes, yes, yes.
I
Okay.
am here to talk about a graduate dissertation I did a long time ago called Utopia and the Apocalypse, creating a framework of survival systems. So a little bit about me. I am an architect. I'm a licensed architect. I worked in many different venues, but a few years ago I went off on my own and started focusing on residential construction, but I do also consult with New York State and the International Code Council on building codes, which we're going to actually talk about later in this. So before we begin, for those who don't know, this is a shot of Lord Humongous from the movie Mad Max 2. I assume many of you are familiar, but if not, you should watch a great film series. So the talk I'm going to do, it's broken up into 5 chapters, 2 of which I'm going to go through very quickly because it gets a little more into the weeds than is probably necessary for what you're working on. But the very first chapter is the idea of utopia versus dystopia. I think many of you are familiar with both terms. To oversimplify, utopia is, a perfect society, there's nothing wrong, and dystopia is the literal opposite. Everything is wrong. And I don't want to get too far into the dates here, but dystopia's first appearance, was around 1800s, whereas utopia was hundreds of years before that. And so despite having that huge head start, we are all much more familiar with the idea of dystopia. Most of your movies, your books, comics, video games, paintings, philosophy, we have a lot more familiarity with dystopia over utopia. I bet any one of you could name 10 dystopian movies, but you probably couldn't even name one utopian movie. And if it was, it's most likely a surprise that it turns into a dystopia anyways. And we're going to talk about why that's important. But the first thing is the idea of the survival mentality. Dystopia and utopia, while they're the complete opposite of each other, they are almost the same thing in any aspect. I broke down I broke down my project into 5 categories. The idea of informal authority, some kind of governance for the greater good, the unification of the public, chance for renewal, and then some memory of the past. But both topics have very similar language. For example, the informal authority in the utopian world, it may be a small council that makes decisions that benefits everyone at large. Dystopia could be the same thing, a small council that makes decisions that tries to benefit, but they use violence or intimidation. So again, this is not just me picking and being picky with words. The language and your mentality is going to be a big part of when you're trying to design for, I've called it apocalypse, but as you're going to see, I do wish I called it upheaval. So in the future, I'm going to refer to it as upheaval. So again, we are looking at this idea of upheaval as opportunity, not some desperate struggle. And in fact, when I was doing this project a long time ago, a lot of detractors instantly were kind of weary of it because the idea when you bring up utopia, everyone assumes it's impossible. And yet we've been chasing it. And, as you see in this quote here, Doxiadis actually claims that chase of utopia is why we left caves and moved towards cities. But I would make an argument that it is possible. So again, before we even get into the architecture, psychology was a big part of this. And so kind of continuing the theme of utopia and dystopia being very similar, we have the spectrums of survival. And the subtitle, Many Are Already Here, refers to the fact that when you think about it, there are large portions of the world that have to design as if they're in a dystopia. They do not have the same infrastructure many of us have. And so the four kind of major aspects of this project and how I've organized this lecture is upheaval, which I do wish I called apocalypse, which I wish I called upheaval. And for the same reason, when you say apocalypse, everyone instantly assumes it has its origins in religious devastation of the world. So when you say apocalypse, people instantly go to a negative place. So it's going to be called apocalypse in a lot of my graphics. I do wish I called it upheaval. But so the idea of using upheaval as a chance to adapt, not just chase your desire for comfort, psychology, almost as important as the architecture itself, the idea that we're trying to build communities, not just simply making factions. The aspect of survival, we're trying to thrive, not just endure. And then the idea of domicile, we are trying to create communities or settlements, not just taking shelter. So moving on to chapter 2, the idea of upheaval or apocalypse and some of the graphics. I quote here Professor Lorenzo Di Tommaso, and they wrote a book about how people view, as he refers to it, the apocalyptic worldview. And so, again, I think I've covered it a little bit, but the reality is nobody is looking forward to the collapse of the world. Well, some are, but most aren't. But there is something that fascinates everyone about it. I'll admit, I watch every movie and show about this subject. And what they bring up is the idea is that there's kind of two things everyone believes, and that is that there's something wrong with the world. And I think that's become even more true since I took this project on a long time ago. But that there's also a chance for a better future. And so, ironically, something as violent as an upheaval kind of provides an opportunity to fix the things that are viewed as wrong, and also give us the chance to do that. And I hope it's clear by now in the way I talk and some of the stuff I show. I do think that architectural frameworks could truly create a positive experience. Not when I initially kind of pitched my graduate project, a lot of people thought I was talking about, salvaging and scavenging, corrugated sheet metal, bombed out buildings, and then just kind of doing architecture on top of that. But instead, it's actually a much more psychological aspect to it. It's the idea of creating a truly and as you'll see, the goal became at the end a self-sufficient society. We green and sustainable are the real big buzzwords in construction and architecture nowadays, but I don't think it's a secret that we as a planet or country are doing enough. Slapping solar panels on some roofs is not going to solve the climate problems. We have to truly find some self-sufficiency. And I guess it's almost ironic, but a complete upheaval does give us the chance to finally get to do that. But I am getting ahead of myself. So we talked about the idea of survival mentality, but there's also the idea of the theory of radical engagement. And this is a graphic by, I believe, Mo. I have that included at the end of the sources. And it's the idea that it isn't just about the actions you take towards survival, it's also about your outlook. And when you look at this graph, positive outlook is not simply keeping a smile on and always being positive. It is about moving forward with purpose and truly moving towards this sufficient future. Without getting too political, I think many of us could agree that we're sort of in this sustained optimism phase. Many have a positive outlook, but as far as action, not much is being done. What we really need to move towards is keeping a positive outlook, but we need to actually move forward with some radical ideas. So again, as I've mentioned, psychology is a huge part of this. Of course, design is going to matter, but how we attempt to solve these problems, and there's a lot of them, is just as important. The reality, and I even wrote it, the reality is we can't just build stuff, or we get shanty towns or kind of dilapidated buildings that we can shelter in. We need to move towards a utopian city. And so one thing that was worth looking at least I thought, is that there is already, and there's been a growing movement of prepping, doomsday preppers. And so I facetiously included these two images on the left, and I won't name the company, are of two different luxury bunkers. You can purchase them. They're there if you ever need them. And I think I've made it clear in the way I'm talking, these are a novelty. If you even look in the image, they have televisions and lights, and I'm sure they claim to have a generator system. But the reality is, in a true upheaval, these well-furnished spaces are not going to solve anything. They're just going to be well-furnished tombs. They're just underground hotel rooms. That's not what we're trying to do. And I think many of us agree with that. The images on the right are from the U.S. Army Survival Manual. And so again, these are much more practical solutions, and it is a great book to read. But, just like we don't want to live in a hotel underground that needs power and water that we don't have, we also don't want to live in a 6-foot hole underground underneath, a downed tree. Yes, that's one way to survive. It's a short-term solution, though. That's not a desired state to live. So really, the whole paradox of this project was how do we bridge the gap? How do we have truly self-sufficient society? How do we have, how do we survive, but actually we survive in a space we want to live in? And so this is where the idea, we also need long-term solutions. prepping, I'm not speaking ill of it, but no matter how much food you hoard, it can only be stored for so long. Without refrigeration, it doesn't last infinitely. And so moving right into that, the idea of the myth of the lone wanderer, I've already admitted it. I've watched every television show or movie about the dystopia. And I'll use a really popular example. The Walking Dead is a television show. I've watched it all. I was a big fan, even in the not so great years. Even 10 years into the zombie apocalypse, they are still scavenging grocery stores. And I don't have a slide dedicated to it, but every simulation, every mathematician, every study shows that were the world truly to shut off and we truly get get this upheaval I'm referencing, the entire country, the entire world would be picked clean within weeks. So again, the idea of scavenging, it's great for television. It's not a solution. We have to do something active. And that's why, again, I call it the myth, because individuals cannot just wander around, find stuff to eat, sleep, and then move on. We truly do need community. And so the graph here shows, what does every human need? The individual has the same needs of a community, but smaller, of course, but they need to deal with waste. They need to get food and they need water. Yeah, I would argue that shelter is needed as well, but at the very base level of survival, food, water, and to deal with waste. Same thing a community needs. The thing is, as an individual, all of those needs actually create problems. Your waste creates a sanitary concern. Food is finite. You can't scavenge for it. Even a skilled hunter is going to run into some problems. Water, I would argue, is even less finite. You have to find it, but you also have to manage, filter it, treat it. So not being in a community really puts you at a disadvantage. There's also the fact of dealing with safety. Now, again, I'm not trying to paint a picture that the world's going to go to war, but safety is a concern, especially in the we'll call it the immediate future after such an event happens. And then again, while they may find some food and some water, they have to produce it, they have to harvest it. And as an individual, that's very difficult. So the too long didn't read version of that, we need to build towards the dynamic city, we'll call it. And so we start as individuals, we have to move towards community. And so, there's always that myth that, well, when you have more people, it's more mouths to feed. And that is true, but it's also more hands to create. At the very top, I have the title of economies of scale. For those of you who aren't familiar, economies of scale is the idea that even if you're adding time or effort to a task, it still is easier and quicker as it goes on. Simple example, if you were asked to write a 10-page paper, it might take you a certain amount of hours. If you had to write a 20-page paper, it won't take double the time. You will have your rhythm, you'll be getting better at it, you'll kind of hit your groove, for lack of a better word. So it's the same thing with this community. The amount of effort it takes one person to create a water and food system would be significant. Even just having 2 or 3 people, it doesn't double or triple that effort. It actually makes it easier. And there's also the idea that safety is increased. Safety in numbers, pretty basic. And then also the informal idea that your knowledge and skills are very unique to each person. One person does not know everything. So the more that you have, the easier it is. And kind of continuing with that theme, I'm going to keep referencing media because we all watch movies and watch TV. Every show, every movie, it's always people getting together in kind of tribes and going to war. There is enough data out there that we can confidently state that human beings don't, we bond, we don't go to battle. I have 2 quotes here from a gentleman named Paul, from 2 gentlemen, Paul and Ron Gatt, and they wrote a book called Dispelling the Myths of Panic. And what's interesting is when I was working on this project, and even now as I talk about it, people always kind of challenge me that it's hard to theorize about all this stuff when the world hasn't hit its upheaval. And while there's some truth to that, there's been quite a few events that still have provided, I think, enough examples. As the Gantz mentioned, people live they live as they die. Excuse me, sorry, in communities. And the city I reference the most, and you're going to see this a lot more, is New York City. When I did my project, I needed to have a site to test all these theories on. New York City at the time had already had plenty of events, and it had quite a few more after this that I'm going to talk about. But a perfect example is after September 11th, 2001, the rate in crime had dropped significantly. I believe it goes something from like 12 or 1,300 crimes for every 100,000 people down to 300. And so again, the world did not end, but that event was so close to an upheaval for them that, and it did show that they did bond and they did stick together. And in fact, what's worth mentioning is after I had written this, quite a few years later, something I think all of us still remember pretty freshly, COVID-19 hit. And while I don't have data from that, there's plenty of studies and data that show that when COVID-19 hit, and I think that's the closest the world has had to its truly negative apocalypse, it did show that most people stuck together, formed communities, worked together. They didn't go to war. Yes, some grocery stores had some problems, but for the most part, we worked together. We did not literally, as I said, go to war. And so moving forward, we talk about the idea of refuge versus construction, limited construction. These two images on the left are of Tower of David, a huge unfinished skyscraper in Venezuela, 50 stories. At the time of writing this thesis, it had 3,000 occupants who had lived there for decades. It's not finished. There's literally no roof at the top. It's missing elevators. There's no elevator. There's a lot of stairs missing. And so while it's not a perfect example, it does show that people can start to build a sufficient community. However, as I've argued, and I think as you are doing in your project, you're not trying to just take refuge in an existing building. You're trying to create something with limited construction. This tent structure that I unfortunately am drawing a blank on the name of at the moment is kind of a perfect example of, even with limited material and construction, we can create a shelter. Now, again, moving forward to the idea of growing, we started with the individual. They move on to then form small groups. And then hopefully the goal is those small community cells, we'll call them, start to communicate with each other. We wouldn't want a city with 8 million 10-person groups. We would want, communities, then neighborhoods, and as we're going to see in a future slide, moving all the way up to the dynamic city. How this would probably come about is the idea of trade. No matter your skill set, your location matters. So a group near a body of water would have either surplus water or maybe even fish, which is going to be one of the most important things we'll talk about in the future. And so again, whether it's starting with an informal trade network, the idea is that we want to move past our small, tight-knit group and slowly build a bigger neighborhood. So moving on to chapter 3, this is one of the two sections I'm going to go through very quickly because it was very specific to my project. It might not be as relevant to yours, but it is worth discussing, I think, at least. So as I've mentioned, one of the challenges I kept running into is it's very hard to test a lot of this. And so I chose a very specific scenario. It made it a lot easier to respond to things, to look things up, and to test. And so I do believe on your projects, it may be the same way, that it might help to have some kind of framework to see what you're testing against. As it's been in all the things I've talked about, I used New York City. It's a literal island, very populated city, very dense urban setting. It also sadly has a lot of, it had a lot of examples of disaster scenarios that provided data for some of the psychological stuff, and it's had even more since then. But the other thing that we'll talk about towards the end of this chapter is it also has a legal governing document. So if an emergency ever happened, there was supposed to be a framework in place. And the word supposed is important because, as we're going to talk about, it didn't work. So one thing I think is worth talking about is, as I mentioned, it's a lot easier to specifically test something because the idea of, this post-apocalypse, this grand upheaval, this could be multiple thesis projects. There's so much to respond to and so much to research. So I was advised, and I'm grateful that I was, to narrow down what I was looking at. So I'd broken it up. I had said that there was 4 categories of upheaval: war and violence, pandemic, contagion, the collapse of our infrastructure or technology, and then environmental disaster. And then I had 7 factors of how each category would be affected. So those were, how drastically is the world affected? How would humans interact with each other? How's the technology affected? Scarcity? Does the built environment survive? Ecological impact, and then the likelihood. And so while this sounds like a lot of busy work, it was very helpful because there is a large difference. For example, in the case of pandemic, the built environment is perfectly intact, nothing changes. War, however, a lot of buildings tend to get destroyed. So that's just one example on having these different scenarios to look at made it a lot easier to respond to. And so I also specifically chose not just New York City, but I chose the borough of Manhattan and even picked a couple buildings in the Upper West Side. And as I kind of had mentioned, New York had a legal document called the Public Health Legal Manual that if a state of emergency was declared, they had these emergency powers and ordinances. I don't want to read all these ordinances to you, but if you go back and look, they had the ability to control who went in and out of certain cities. They had the ability to relocate resources. They even had the ability to maybe do what's called kind of emergency quarantines. At the time, was hailed as very kind of dogmatic and apocalyptic and almost like an abuse of power. But as I've said, something did happen. COVID-19 hit. And again, I don't want to get too political here, but this was a good example that governing bodies and kind of documents like this are not a good solution because even with this in place, New York City, the country in general, I think kind of did very poorly with COVID, and we sort of kind of lucked out with that it didn't get more severe. So to simplify that, a legal document is not what's going to protect us in a disaster. It really is the framework of survival systems I keep harping in. And to kind of go into the specifics, the part that we are going to spend probably the most time is the actual framework I've talked about. I'm not a big fan of reading the quotes to you, but I am going to read a big chunk of this one. With a source of food, water, and power, and even a means to control waste production, no longer seems challenging. In fact, it appears life can begin anew. We're not aiming to simply meet our basic needs. We're actually planning on creating the self-sufficient city. And so this begins with creating a closed loop system, which not only encompasses all our systems to survive, but also the ability to be treated modularly throughout the city. And again, that idea of modularity is going to come up a few times. But a case in point, again, the goal became not just moving towards from the individual to the dynamic city, but also those communities had to create self-sufficient systems in order to prevent themselves from starving out, etc. So we've already talked about it. What do humans need? We need food, we need water, we need to deal with waste, and we do need power generation. That doesn't mean we need electricity to run televisions, but we do need to create some sort of power to heat, to cool, but also to try to advance our food storage, etc. So it may be a little archaic, but we need something. So again, I just scratched the surface of each of those, but what I was able to come across and what I'm always excited to see other students take on, and I still read about this to this day, each one of these systems kind of can create a closed loop system, and they all can kind of be plugged into each other as well. Each system has inputs it needs, and it creates what's called waste. What you'll find, even with my very kind of introductory scratching of each subject, they all kind of can plug into each other, and there's this utopian idea. It seems somewhat feasible. I'm very excited to see this someday. So for example, food. I had chosen New York City, even if you're not studying New York City, in a dense urban area. When someone tells you you need to produce food, your first answer is farming. Problem with that is it takes a lot of space and a lot of skill to that, and not everyone knows how to farm, and we certainly don't have the space in a city like New York. So then the obvious answer is hydroponics. And while I do think hydroponics is part of the answer, it has a lot of wasteful byproducts. And what this kind of became the hidden key to the puzzle I was struggling with, and that is I found out that the use of fish in something called aquaculture uses a lot of the waste byproducts of hydroponics, and so they plug into each other. And that is, at least from my personal, that was when this started to really move forward for me. And so again, I could spend all day and night talking about these subjects. A hydroponic system creates water. Water is filtered, and again, we'll use this very basic diagram. Water is filtering through the plants. It then comes out very oxygenated and very nutrient rich. That's not good for humans to drink, but it's perfect for fish. So again, the waste of a hydroponic system actually feeds the fish system. And as we're going to see, that can plug into other systems as well. talking about water, of course, we all need water to drink. We actually need water on a more regular basis than food, but water can also be used for other things. I refer to as drink habitat and heating. Again, I think fish and aquaculture, and my own bias, is part of the solution in the future. So we need to put them in water. So again, large pools of water, and you'll notice in a lot of my diagrams, I always have the elevator cores hollowed out. Without electricity, those elevator cores, they might be seen as wasted space, but something I did that always came off very idealistic is they could be perfect chambers for water. And in fact, when you have large chambers of water, they can very easily be used for heating and cooling. As the water pool is heated up, it releases heat at night when we need heat. Vice versa. During the day, when we need to cool down the building, the water's been cooling all night, it can release cold air. So again, I have very simplistic diagrams, but the idea of thinking about water as more than something we need to drink, I think truly can create this self-sufficient city we keep talking about. And so again, as I kept mentioning, waste is not waste, and I keep using the term waste for all the other systems, but this slide is specifically about human waste. It's a subject not everyone likes talking about. It always comes off very uncomfortable and crass, but the reality is cities that don't deal with waste get very sick and die. And again, we have plenty of examples in history of that. So one of the first things in this upheaval, people are still going to use the bathroom no matter what's going on. We have to deal with it. I just so happen to come across something that makes it a byproduct that we could use. And again, there's a lot of science involved. I'm just very briefly describing it. When your waste is placed in an airtight cistern, there's a process called anaerobic digestion. And what that does is, as time goes on, I'm sorry, I chuckle, I use the term ferment. Your waste can ferment, and it creates two byproducts: biogas, which is, the methane in pure gas form, and then a nutrient-rich liquid referred to as slurry, fortunately. And biogas can be used in a propane tank. It can be used as a source of power and a source of cooking. And I got a lot of pushback, and I'm sure some of you are wincing a little bit. Using biogas to cook is being done. And in fact, a study I found by Warren Weissman shows that, human biogas is 60% efficient versus the 10% that most biomass cookers use. So again, it's a bit of a stigma, but human waste can be used. Biogas that's created from this process can be used for heating, cooking, and other power sources. And again, we don't use a lot of things powered by propane, so there's a bit of a shift in thinking how our infrastructure is built. That nutrient-rich liquid I referred to is perfect for plants. And so as I've kind of given it away, these all can start to plug into each other. And again, this is a very basic diagram I had put together, but simply put, and again, I don't want to go through it all together, but human waste creates biogas, which can be used for electricity and cooking. That slurry or sludge can be used as fertilizer. Fertilizer, again, the waste of that can be given to your fish. The fish waste can be plugged back in. It also creates a lot of nitrates that goes into your plant system, which is tough to see here. That filtration of those plants gives you cleaned water for your fish, as well as, with some other systems I'm kind of glossing over, in a way to kind of increase the breathing capacity of your air. And so again, it's not as simple as me just waving my cursor around. I understand that. But again, it shows that all these systems can be self-sufficient on their own. They can be plugged into each other. And so, a quote I always used when I was presenting this was, Utopia is not at odds with the apocalypse. It can only be achieved in the apocalypse. So now I would change that to upheaval. But again, the idea of utopia isn't just possible in some grand event like this. This is the only time it would happen. No one is going to create a fish farm right now because we're all very complacent. None of us are using our human biogas because it sounds disgusting, because we're in a very complacent setting. So again, very simplistic. I'm not an engineer. I don't have the numbers on how these systems would specifically work, but it can be done. And there are places in the world where it is being done. And then, so moving on, I had referred to the term dynamic city. I've given away the goals of the project. We want to create self-sufficient cities. We also want to start as the individual, but we want to move towards the dynamic city. And so again, how does that happen? Well, as we've seen in previous slides, you have the individual meeting with other individuals, forming their community. those communities, and I use the term retrofitting a physical shell, the idea that they're setting up in an existing building. Your projects, and I wish I'd gone back and done this on mine, are going to be more about designing from the start an integrated, sufficient building. But those buildings or shells are near other buildings and shells, so you start to form a small little communication network, starts to form what is termed the static cell. Enough of them cells will begin to form districts, and then truly our utopian goal, those districts can create the dynamic city. So it's a city of all these different community modules, and they all are self-sufficient or sufficient enough that they can help each other. Sometimes this gets shut down because a truly self-sufficient system is very difficult, but even a near perfect system is better than no system at all. They can still help each other with their waste and input. Now, again, I'm waving my hand around. You can't see it. I'm waving my cursor around a lot and making it sound very easy. And I do hope there's some excitement on your end about some of these potentials. But there's also some physical limits that I had to start thinking about, and you will as well. You know, I specifically chose skyscrapers because I needed a site and I needed buildings. And I'd mentioned Tower of David before. It's a 50-story building. No one lives on anywhere above the 28th floor, 27th or 28th. And that is because the reality is without power, there's no elevators, and no biogas system is going to power an elevators, not for a long time at least. So human beings don't walk up and down 50 stories. In fact, they usually can't. We have a tolerance of 3 to 5 stories, and 5 stories is pushing it. So in my example, I had, and again, if I had another year, I would have continued with this theme, the idea that there are people living in that Tower of David that don't leave their 3-story community. They might be on the 15th floor, and they don't leave those 3 floors most of their life. So if you're working on a project, you need to deal with the height of your structure or your city. And so that's just one example. I could spend all day talking about physical limits. But again, not only are you trying to design your self-sufficient system, you're going to have new limits that we don't have right now. We can build tall buildings. We have elevators. We don't in the future, so height might be one thing to deal with. There's hundreds of others we could talk about as well. And so for our final chapter here, again, this is the second of the 2 sections that I'm going to go over very quickly because it was very specific to me, and I think you're doing something different. But that is how I actually was going to apply this. You know, as my graduate thesis, it did need to have deliverables. I did need to kind of present a solution. And so one of the first challenges I had that I do think is worth talking about specifically for yours is, you know, there's 69,000 buildings in the city of New York. I can't analyze every single one and apply a thing. So instead, I started looking at different building typologies. Specifically, as you saw, I looked at skyscrapers. I also looked at open atrium center buildings. And so the idea is maybe breaking down buildings into types and then kind of getting an application or solution to each one of those. That may be something worth doing on your end as well, as looking at buildings, not every single building, but types of very common typologies. So what is, I think, worth talking about is, and this is just one example, there's others that we're just not going to talk about today in the interest of time, is trying to apply some of the existing technologies in a unique way or maybe a very scaled up way. So for example, this was the idea of using the elevators like a gravity light. For those who don't know, a gravity light it's an invention that's used in countries that don't have a very stable power infrastructure. It very simply is a weighted piece on a string. You pull it all the way up, and when you let go, it slowly starts to pull itself down. There is a friction something inside it, some kind of dynamo, that as the weight is pulling down, it spins and it creates power. So a light is generated. So it's simply using gravity and friction to create power. Now, again, it's a small light. It doesn't need much. But I was very fascinated by that. And so again, as I was looking at skyscrapers, they all are going to have these large elevator cores that no one's ever going to have an elevator in again. So I had the thought of, could those elevators do something like a 10,000 timed increased version of that gravity light? Could the elevator slowly pull down and the use of friction generate some kind of power? Whether that was feasible or not, I also came across, there was another problem I was trying to solve, and that is, I'm talking about using water, but without electricity, how do we pipe water up a few stories? Well, again, and I think it's in the next slide, what about the use of some kind of retractable siphons in the pipes? So as the elevator is pulling down, the siphons are pulling in the opposite direction, slowly bringing the water up. So again, I'm very speaking very generally, but the elevator could provide power, could also start to cause the water to move, and in a closed vacuum system, that water can start to pump itself, and the siphoning could only help it. So again, this idea of a gigantic gravity light is a little far-fetched, but it did start to lead me down the trail of applying it to other systems. So I had, in theory, solved two problems: power generation and pumping water in a skyscraper without electricity. Now, this is going to need a lot more engineering applied to it, and maybe someday I can pitch it on Shark Tank. But it did, again, it's very helpful to take this very utopian, idealistic idea and make it seem plausible, because that's, at the end of the day, you're going to need to do something that you can convince others to do. And so, again, the overall theme of this slide in general was, while you're doing you're doing your projects, look at existing technology. Can it be scaled up? Can it be used in a way you didn't think of? And again, in this theme of plugging into self-sufficient systems, can you apply these technologies together? They all have some kind of downside. They all have some kind of fuel needed. Can you have them provide the fuel to each other with their waste byproducts? This example being the gravity providing some kind of system for pumping. And so the direction my project took, and if I was ever given a chance, what I would love to do with it again, I had looked at building typologies, the skyscrapers, and then also open atrium kind of buildings. And I had put together a system that could be deployed. It's a large case. It took up the space of, I think, a 9x9 closet. And the idea is, if the day ever came, you could deploy it through your system. It was a track and rail system. Sounds simple enough, but of course it would be much more involved. But you could simply, open up the door, lay down some track, and then start installing all the new infrastructure you need. And again, who knows, maybe someday they'll show up on Shark Tank. But the idea that's, I think, a little challenging there is that your project specifically, while this is a good solution possibly for retrofitting, I think what really needs to happen is buildings need to be integrated from the beginning with this idea. Instead of retrofitting some kind of biogas propane system, the building should have that to begin with. Maybe it doesn't start with biogas. While things are good, we can use, propane or electricity, but that when the time comes, it's already there. So when you're doing your buildings, think of it that way. Instead of retrofitting an existing shell, it's an integrated design. The need for retrofitting still exists. Not tomorrow, things could change, and we're still not going to be able to make every building ready for the new upheaval future. So there's some case, but I don't think it's quite as simple as something I can stuff in a closet. Maybe it's a good starting point, though. So again, the idea for you, think about it in an integrated fashion, not just something that's deployed. So as we're wrapping this up, this is the introduction, and I'm not being coy when I say that. This is just everything I referenced in this lecture. There is so much information about this topic. I hope you are interested to read some more. This is all a great starting point, and you could go even further with this. So it's a tough subject to theorize about a future that hasn't happened, but we have a lot of data, studies, even some simulations, because a lot of things have been happening. So the information's out there. And again, not to keep talking about this as if you had to make sales pitches, but everything we do as architects, we gotta sell it to a client. Someone's got to pay for it. The more data, the more real world examples you can show, the better your case could be. So the finale, where do we go from here? Or more specifically, where do you go from here? My goals when I did this was the city and self-sufficiency. And so I think for you, the idea of self-sufficiency or resilient structure is still the goal. But again, I gave it away in the previous slide, doing it in an integrated fashion so it doesn't look like, you're tacking something onto existing buildings. It's something that we would want, that's true architecture to begin with, but it also is ready for, sadly, what may come. Many believe this is coming. When I was, and again, when I was pitching this, I did have some who said, giving up a lot of square footage of an apartment is kind of tough for something that might not ever happen. And my answer was always, rolling blackouts are happening. Parts of the country and the world are living in something that looks like this already, the upheaval. But then, my pithy statement is there is no middle class comfort in the apocalypse, the upheaval. There's only survival. So again, just the attitude that this is something we have to deal with. I had hinted at the very beginning, that I consult with the building code. Some steps are being taken for resiliency in the future and some climate proofing. It's not enough and it needs to be more radical. And so our designs absolutely are going to have to be the thing that bridges that gap. So again, I want to thank you all so much for listening. It was very fascinating to read about all this again. It's been a long time. I don't get to work on a lot of apocalyptic structures in my practice. My email is here. Please contact me or reach out on LinkedIn. I'd love to answer questions or talk about it. I hope there's a list of questions in the chat when I'm done here so we can jump right in. There's no awkward waiting. This last image is, it's a real building. This is the Yancey Chapel by Samuel Mockbee in his rural studio. I had made a joke earlier about not slapping corrugated steel on stuff, but their projects were always low-cost built environments with local materials. These are used tires and a fill nearby with some sand plaster made right on site. This is salvaged corrugated steel on some found trees. Very beautiful space. And again, it's done with a limited construction mentality. If they just get some water and food generation in here, this is almost a good example of what we could do in the future. So thank you all again, and I can't wait to take some of your questions. All right, can you hear me?
Hello, Bryan, thank you so much. This was it's great to hear how you approached it. There will be a little bit of awkwardness. Does anybody have a question? Then I will start. Maybe this is not related directly to the way that you tackled it, to the way that you decided to survive, because you chose a built environment and then you retrofitted it. But I'm curious to know what's your opinion on the way we're trying to see it here is there will be scarcity in a time, upheaval time, but there will be also abundance and there will be surplus of materials or human power. I'm not very sure. So I would like to ask you, how do you see that? How do you see that relation between scarcity and abundance?
Just to make sure I heard it, could be a technical issue at my end. The last half got very hard to hear. Were you asking about the idea of abundance and scarcity kind of in apocalypse or upheaval? Was that the last part?
Yes, exactly. How do you see that?
Well, so a great question. And so it's true. I tried to keep my mentality very positive, and I always talked about it, that dealing it with scarcity. Regarding abundance, so I'll answer it in two parts. There's the architectural aspect. Like I said, I guess without oversimplifying, you have my camera's up here. I apologize, but I see you all right here. You have the opportunity to have it, like you said. I don't want to say just go steal and borrow from your surrounding environment, but you do have that ability. And so again, there's that opportunity that you have. Some might see that as a limitation, but again, there is something to be said about the local character and context of architectural neighborhoods. So not that every building is a carbon copy, but buildings in a neighborhood tend to, except for certain places, look like they belong there. So you have the abundance of material, but when you take from a nearby building, you're not exactly, if you do it properly, you wouldn't end up with kind of a mishmash of a building that you might see in media. It could still look characteristically like it belongs there. Does that answer your question in a way?
In a way, yes. I have a second one, which is about, well, maybe I should ask. I want to ask a second one, maybe students want to ask too. And it's related to can you hear me again?
I can hear you. Yeah, sometimes it just gets loud. All of a sudden, I can't hear it. That's all.
I'm trying to use the speaker. I'm trying to use a microphone.
Yep.
And
I hear you.
so it's about the psychology, right? You said that COVID-19 showed us that we collaborate.
Yes.
But in a way, also it showed how people can make a huge profit out of like a terrible situation, right? So my question would be, I love the graph where you can choose in between, when you classify the attitude towards survival, and I want to ask about that. So what are the chances of us really engaging and creating community? And we've been talking, or we are presenting the next phase, talking about I'm sure you are familiar with the Maslow hierarchy of needs, so the pyramid of needs. How do you see that? Meaning, do we have to fulfill our own physiological needs before we think about creating community, or do you think that after a transformation we will jump into working as a group directly?
That's a great question. And again, so my graduate dissertation was 10 to 14 years ago. I should have the exact date and I don't. So reading it is a little odd because what I didn't mention in the lecture was I picked pandemic and I got pushback that the idea of a virus taking out the planet was very far-fetched. So it's very creepy reading this when luckily COVID didn't do that, but COVID hit. COVID did provide a perfect opportunity to what you talked about. There's a lot of examples. All the studies I read and all this we're always in a climate disaster where the economy was removed almost. So when there's no chance for profit, when economy isn't in the picture, people absolutely work together and they help each other. Sadly, as you brought up with COVID, I'm going to try to not use colorful language. Certain groups of people thought because the economy was still there, they could make a lot of profit off toilet paper, hand sanitizer, and food. So my answer is I still believe that if the world were to hit this upheaval and turn off, because the economic systems would be gone, the lack of a profit incentive, we would still have this community. Now, that's a little personal. I don't exactly have the data, but all the studies I reference in those sources, and I encourage everyone to look, there was no market, no economy, so people did band together. COVID showed that because the world kept trying to keep its economy, profit did take advantage. But even so, and I try not to use too many personal anecdotes because I don't want it to be my opinion, I can personally state that after 3 weeks of not getting certain supplies, we had a young child at home. People we didn't really know in the street came through for us. So again, that's not a disaster scenario, but it is some personal anecdote of my own that people still tried to help out and band together. And then, so I'm sorry, you're the last part of your question. There is a psychological need to take care of yourself before the community. So I do think the amount of time after such a big event kind of plays into it. I think there'll be a short-term panic or shelter in place and wait for things to hopefully go back to normal, which we saw with COVID. But eventually the time will come where people realize it isn't happening. And it's very, as we saw, I guess I'll just keep talking about COVID. As we saw with COVID, many people who were kind of isolated to themselves, they quickly found how hard things can be without a community. You know, there truly a psychological aspect to being with people, and COVID proved that it is very hard to make it alone. So I hope that answers kind of what you were asking.
That's very well. Thank you so much. We have a next question from one of our teachers.
Yeah, I have a question, but first I would like to make a comment about what you just said, because I think you all had very interesting observations during COVID. So basically, when COVID hit, I was living in London, and I remember this friend who was a typical London trader told me, we asked him like, what about the business? How is it going? And he told us like, oh, there's what about this problem about COVID? He said, oh, I don't see a problem, I see only opportunities. So basically, while capitalism is on, you will always feed it with kind of opportunities. And that reminds me of this sentence. I don't know who said this quote, maybe you know, but it's easier to imagine the end of the world, but more difficult to imagine the end of capitalism. Oh, no, it's easier. Okay, Mark Fisher. Okay, so it's a. I think what you are doing here is imagining the end of the world, like that ends also capitalism, and that's why you managed to say like, okay, we start kind of economy gonna change. Economy also is misunderstood as being business, but economy is much more than that. It's also a change between individuals and communities. So we could reimagine a good of economy, and that brings me to my question. Like, how did you use? Personally, I watch also Walking Dead, and I think it's pretty accurate vision. I mean, of course, it's an American show, typical, but I think that there are many good things to pick up from that. And I was wondering if you have any example from Walking Dead in specific, but maybe from Mad Max as well.
Just again, because your question was, did Walking Dead provide some realistic
Yeah.
examples? Okay.
Some example you used in your thesis, basically.
Yes. Well, it's funny because, as I said, at the time of writing that, Walking Dead had not finished. So it was still, and I don't remember what season it is. I hinted it was one of my least favorite seasons. It was probably halfway through. Very heavy on people scavenging, I said grocery stores and people going to war with each other. What has happened since then is the show finished, and I don't want to spoil anything for anyone, but they did eventually start building with archaic systems. There's even, and again, I don't know, there's a character that goes around with a manual of how agrarian societies built their windmills and their milling systems. So the show did, I think, and I'm not just saying it, the show did back up what I've been saying, that there's a certain amount of time people will try to shelter and scavenge and hoard, but eventually they have to produce or they die out. I do, again, I know I got a lot of pushback because I was very optimistic during all my presentations, and I would always get pushback that eventually there would be violence. Somebody would want what other people have. And my answer was there are studies that show that that threat is there. And that's why this is, I don't want to give that selfish reason for community, but that is one of the biggest things about safety in numbers. The threat of the numbers, the safety in numbers has tended to delay violence. So what I think Walking Dead got wrong, or maybe got right, is they had a group that was so large they took on anyone they found, with Negan. I don't but I think, I don't have the proof, but the data seems to show that if there's enough communities formed, because at the end of the day, people, and again, it's a television show, people don't just do violence for fun. They do it because they want stuff, but the threat of violence from another large group, and I don't want to go off on a Walking Dead tangent. I could talk about Walking Dead on that. So I think it got right that people had scavenged forever. I think what it got wrong is that everyone would just get weapons and go to war with everyone they could. I think survival, they would just focus more on production. It's a personal opinion, but that would be my answer to that. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, last chance. Is there anyone? Yes.
I want to know that what is the difference between the factions and commodity? Because in my thoughts, I always think that people survive and make life by making smaller groups and organizations. So I want to know what is the approach of making a healthy community but not faction.
I do. So you asked what is the difference between community, and then I could not hear the other word. What was the other?
Factions. Right.
It might be the distance for the mic. I'm sorry. I cannot hear the word.
Fractions. Like a fracture.
Oh, faction. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'll be buying a new camera. So
No.
you're asking about the difference between factions and community. So again, a big part of this, and again, I'm thinking back to all my critique reviews. Language was a big part of this, and so while the idea of faction and tribe and community and group is all kind of interchangeable, there is the positive side versus the negative side. And so faction, if you look at the dictionary, the difference between faction and community, very similar, but it seems like in a lot of the literature I had done about some kind of conflict, armed conflict, scarcity of a resource struggle, the term faction came up a lot more, faction and tribe. And so again, it's more about just when writing about violence, faction and tribe is used, whereas when writing about positive bonding and kind of growth of a city, community and settlement are used. So I know that's a somewhat superficial answer, but again, just when you're doing all the research for this, you will notice that there's a common way people refer to certain things. When I kept using the term cell. That is not because I want to sound fancy. In all the literature about urban designing, in the apocalypse or the utopia, the idea of cell seems to be a very strong concept. So that word has kind of entered the project.
Very much.
Any other question from the audience? Okay, I think it's the first time we actually get a question from a year one student. That is the first time I can remember, so thank you for that. Right, Brian, I think our time is up. Thank you so much for this. Again, it was very informing and fun.
I'm glad to hear it. If anyone has any questions, I know I talk fast and I had to cover 2 years of my life in 40 minutes, so I glossed a lot over. Please feel free to reach out. When you do the recording, if you could cut out the first 18 minutes of me not getting my camera to work, that'd be great. So,
I will.
okay, great.
Thank you so much again for coming. And
Well, enjoy the rest of your day. My day's over now. So, have a great night. Have a great day.
Okay, we can return to regular tutorials. As you know, today we will finish class at 11:15 because we have a faculty meeting.
Really related, very specific.
Yeah, but I mean, I talked to him a couple of times.